to assimilate the painterly formulae of Flanders without renouncing the lyricism characteristic of the Cologne school, and Hans Mulchner and Martin Schongauer, who transferred the clean-cut art of the Burin to canvas, a whole hierarchy existed in terms both of formalism and interpretation of reality. This led to the emergence of figures such as Konrad Witz and his luminous universe, or Hans Holbein, who managed to combine the Gothic tradition with the Flemish Ars Nova. Above all, however, the excellence of German painting was due to the originality of masters like Lucas Cranach, born at the close of the century, who infused their work with a spirit of irony and criticism. Thus we have the dramatically intimist style of Matthias Grunewald and the virile poetics of Albrecht Dürer, who raised German art to one of the highest summits in its history. In the Life of Mary altarpiece painted in Cologne, the rhythms of Van der Weyden and the delicacy of Boots are combined with the coldness of empty spaces. At the same time in Bavaria, Hans Pleyenwurf's Resurrection reveals an interpretation far removed from Flemish canons. Along these same lines, the later work of Lucas Cranach, such as Venus and Cupid with the Honeycomb, gradually became jocular and sensual, revealing a morbid, unmistakably Germanic poetic. Early in the 15th century, the international Gothic style reached Spain via the Pyrenees. A new style born in Avignon, fruit of the meeting between Sienese painting and the French Gothic. This highly elegant, decorative, courtesan painterly formula, somewhat bland and mannerist, found fertile soil in Aragon and Catalonia, whose painters, deeply influenced for so long by Italian art, soon realized that the old Sienese delicacy and modern French affectation would inevitably reach a mutual understanding. By contrast, during the second half of the century, there was a tendency towards the dry expressionism of the Flems, leading to the emergence of the Hispano-Flemish school, that although it certainly flourished in the kingdoms of Aragon and Valencia, where it became impregnated with a certain Italian ethnicity, acquired a new identity in Castile, where it incorporated aspects of the deeply rooted Spanish mudéjar style. Bernardo Martorell contributed a meticulously narrative strand to the international Gothic, thus creating a school that for many years coexisted in Catalonia with a new Flemish current. This current was introduced there early by Louis Dalmau and was subsequently reinterpreted by Jaume Huguet. Meanwhile, in Castile, Nicolas Frances and Nicolas Florentino were the representatives of the international Gothic. Although the great masters, such as Fernando Gallego, cultivated the Flemish style, to which they contributed original, dramatic, and highly expressive vigor. The famous St. Dominic by Bartolomé Bermejo is undoubtedly the masterpiece of Aragon, while its counterpart in Catalonia is the altar of Saints Abdon and Senen by Jaume Huguet. In Valencia, the exquisite Maesta de Segorbe by Jacquemart reveals the eclectic spirit of this great artist, who was very well versed in Italian art. The Castilian Pedro Berruguete, author of the magnificent panel of the Auto da Fe, was also highly influenced by the Italian Quattrocento.
Fifteenth-century painting, born from dark medieval symbolism, evolved and helped to create a new idea of the world. The old trilogy of Satan, the world and flesh gradually gave way to a philosophical concept in which God, man, sin, death and redemption formed a chain. These would be the great themes of painting: man in his everyday reality and God sharing this occasionally without ever ceasing to dominate it. A complex pictorial universe, that of 15th century artists who lived and worked with their minds in the future and their feelings in the past.
The scenes of the Passion of Christ, culminating in the crucifixion, were two of the prominent themes of altarpiece painting. Everything that Christ experienced during that time is represented in 15th century painting. From the entry into Jerusalem, the expulsion of the merchants from the temple, Judas's betrayal, the Last Supper, the arrest, and finally the humiliation Jesus suffered after the judgment of Caiaphas, leading finally to the long road to Calvary, where the Son of Man would die on the cross. The 15th century artist did not restrict himself to depicting the Virgin in the conventional scenes of the birth and Epiphany. Rather, he reflected the veneration that Mary arose in believers through passages in which the Virgin is the sole protagonist, such as the Annunciation or Piety. As witness to the death, burial and resurrection of the Son, painters also depicted her in the Pentecost and the Passing, invariably in the presence of the Apostles. Alongside the angels, a whole host of martyr saints accompanies sacred figures and constitutes the religious universe of the 15th century. They often surround the Virgin, while others protect donors, and they invariably reveal their attributes as martyrs so that we may recognize them more easily. St. Catherine, with her wheel trimmed with knives and the sword that cut off her head. St. Barbara, with the impregnable tower behind her, in which she was imprisoned by her father as a punishment for defending Christianity. The saints, John the Evangelist and the Baptist, often face each other from side panels, sometimes bearing symbols. On other occasions, suffering martyrdom. Saint Sebastian is probably one of the martyr saints most often featured, although the doctors of the Church gradually acquired greater importance in Christian iconography. The portrait, as a faithful reproduction of the individual, has its origins in the Gothic tradition of the donor, who, as sponsor of the work, both observes and participates in the religious scene. The next step was the portrait per se, devoid of any pictorial pretext, of nobles, the gentry, and even kings, statesmen, and prelates, although an act of blatant human vanity was often disguised behind a veneer of religious fervour. The subjects of some male portraits are figures whose best attire is their own worth. Thus we see sages, architects, and even the reformer Martin Luther. For their part, women are rare, although there are magnificent portraits of young and adolescent women, and above all, of boys and girls, depicted in a far more spontaneous way, their gaze never failing to charm the observer. A warm, secluded space invariably surrounds the subjects of portraits, so that utensils and furniture protect them and bring them closer to us. Light reflects off the walls through windows beyond which we glimpse a meticulously composed landscape, as apparently real and detailed as the interiors. On other occasions, the landscape itself provides the setting. Rivers, valleys, and meadows forming luscious carpets on which the gaze of the observer comes to rest. In the far background, the city forms the horizon as the maximum expression of human activity. The victim of its own condition, mankind cannot free itself from a certain diabolical spirit, although avarice is the sin par excellence. Gold produces as much, if not more, pleasure than lust. Moreover, it serves as the means to purchase a woman's favors. Fifteenth-century painting scoffs at this human condition and sees woman as the culprit of men's perdition, considering her as avaricious and lustful as him, and accusing her of vanity and cunning, qualities embodied by Judith and Salome, for whom Holofernes and John the Baptist literally lost their heads. The imagination of painters, when it came to giving visual form to their thoughts and dreams, their fears and desires, was truly spectacular. Some have described this ability to escape from the real world to that of the imagination and make it credible, even almost habitable, as true surrealist art. There can be no doubt that Hieronymus Bosch was the greatest teller of fables in 15th century painting. And in his works, he takes us from hell to paradise, or to fantastic lands where absolutely nothing is what it seems. Hedonism and bodily pleasures are often featured in 15th century painting. For some, this is moralist criticism of sinfulness, while for others it represents nostalgia for the happy, innocent times before original sin. Eroticism impregnates spaces invented for pleasure, although it never touches naked bodies which are invariably free of malice. It is reserved for everything that surrounds them. Fountains, thorns, and fish as phallic symbols. Luscious fruit as an allegory of the sexual organs. Water and pitchers as symbols of love and squandering. Transparencies that evoke the ephemeral quality of pleasure, and an endless number of suggestive elements we perceive as related to sexual desire. Bold popular ditties and sayings were the source of inspiration for these curious scenes, at times burlesque and at times even perverse. Ecclesiastes says that all flesh is grass, and its splendor like the flowers in the fields. The grass dries up, the flower withers. The fleetingness of life is its most absurd quality, and consequently, in the 15th century pictorial universe, there is no reference either to space or time. Nor is there any distinction between the real and dream worlds. Any offspring of fantasy may inhabit this world, at once bizarre and real, as if seen in a distorting fairground mirror.
Fifteenth century painting, on rigid panel supports, gradually incorporated the technique of oils, to which varnishes and glazes were added to create an effect of transparency and endow surfaces with an enamel-like sheen. Panels would be assembled to form altarpieces, triptychs and polyptychs that often featured complex iconographical programs, their themes echoing the major subjects of debate amongst theologians.
The Piety of Avignon, attributed to Enguerrand Quarton and painted in 1460, is a further version of the familiar motif of Christ lying dead on his mother's lap. The Virgin's grief is shared by St. John and Mary Magdalene. Resigned to a fate she had known long beforehand, Mary worships the body of her son. On the other hand, Mary Magdalene, of an entirely earthly humanity, weeps over the corpse. The holy personages ignore the presence of a kneeling man, the donor, who had funded this religious work on condition that he appear there in pious attitude. The Piety of Avignon is a magnificent illustration of the spirit of 15th century painting. On the one hand, it shows the delicacy and nicety of the international style, visible in the treatment of the faces and the elongated bodies. On the other, we observe that approach to the everyday, to reality, which characterized the new era. The sequence of the three masculine faces is far more eloquent than words. That of Christ, with the eternal beauty of absolute simplicity. That of St. John, more human and more solid, though equally idealized. And finally that of the donor, clearly of flesh and blood, and a man of the world despite his pious expression. The painting is of great compositional elegance, based on the musical aesthetics of balanced forms and the delicacy of the meandering line. St. John and Mary Magdalene wrap the Virgin and Christ in protective drapes. The gilt background opens to reveal the great Temple of Jerusalem, identified with the holy places by virtue of the half-moon of Islam. Nothing distracts the figures from their grief, not even the presence of the donor, who is isolated from the dense atmosphere with which the rest of the painting is impregnated. The main theme is stated explicitly in the words of St. John the Baptist, "The Lamb of God that cleans the world of its sins." And those of the Apocalypse, "This is the fountain of water of life from the throne of God and the Lamb." In other words, it's the redemption, the salvation of mankind through the sacrifice of the Son of God. The angels and the saints flock to worship the Lamb, while the doctors of the church and of the synagogue study the holy scriptures around the fountain. On the side panels, knights, judges, hermits and pilgrims also approach the altar, while the panels above feature the images of God the Father, the Virgin and St. John the Baptist, flanked by magnificent musician angels and by Adam and Eve. To close the polyptych, the holy figures become painted sculptures, color being respected only in the portraits of the donors. Jus Vit and his wife Elizabeth Borlut, protected by the effigies of the two saints, John, the Evangelist and the Baptist, to whom it was once thought to dedicate the Church of St. Bavon. Monumentality defines the characteristic style of the Van Eyck brothers, observable both in the figures that crown the polyptych and in the forcefulness of the characters featured on the panels below. On considering the unity of their style, it must be borne in mind that some of the figures by Hubert van Eyck, such as God the Father, were subsequently repainted by his brother Jan. Furthermore, the existing panel of the Fair Judges is a copy, for the original was stolen in 1934 and has never been recovered. The composition is rigorously symmetrical around a central axis marked by the fountain and the altar. The groups of figures, placed at the four vertices, generate a tense void around the Lamb. This centripetal force is enhanced by the color grading of the ground and a thick grove of orange and pomegranate trees that Jan would probably have seen in Spain. The side panels are independent from the central one, although they share its subject matter, horizon line and luminosity. Painted at the dawn of the new century in 1508, the altar of Eisenheim is Grunewald's masterpiece. It consists of 3 superimposed triptychs.